Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Alexis, hey, could you take a roll for Dan, and he'll show you what he's handing out. Dan in the blue shirt. Yeah, and just, oh no. Anybody that comes in gets, he'll show you what to give them. That'd be great. About ready, partner? This looks tremendous. This is great. Yeah. I had to come up and see this last night. Tremendous.
I wasn't sure.
Dan, all set?
You ready? Welcome, everyone. Plenty of room. Come on in. Get your fact sheet and your card. Because there, like I was telling Alan, there's going to be a test.
I've already flunked it.
Exactly. So it's open book. I mean, come on. It's open book. So I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is Dan. I'm part of the Knights of Columbus here at St. John Neumann, Our Lady of Guadalupe, 12127. Hoorah. We've been doing this for about 5 times. This is the 5th time. It all started because of Alan. He came to me when I was a lecturer and said, we're going to do this. I was like, yes, we are. And he's got a great story. Before we start, though, I wanted to, Pat Skis shared this prayer with me earlier. And I wanted to pray this. Everything's on our phone, right? So, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
My good and dear Jesus, we kneel before you, asking you most earnestly to engrave upon our hearts a deep and lively faith, hope, and charity, with true repentance for our sins and a firm resolve to make amends. As we reflect upon your 5 wounds and dwell upon them with deep compassion and grief, we recall, good Jesus, the words the prophet David spoke long ago concerning yourself. They pierced my hands, my feet, they have numbered all my bones. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you so much. And Monsignor Pankey, I don't see him, but he's a huge supporter of this, as well as the staff here at St. John Neumann. And Jim Wazel, our sound guy. Yeah, you're in good hands.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks to the Knights and to the parish. It's a pleasure to be here for the 4th time. And I'm going to introduce my co-speaker in just a second. But we're here to discuss and to look at the most mysterious and the most researched relic in the world. It's also the most researched artifact in the world. And what are the implications of that? The implications over the years and over centuries that Jimmy and myself will touch on was it a forgery? And on that little fact sheet, on the side that has the very small type, down at the bottom right, I'm going to read this because it says it really well for the introduction. Quote, "It is either the most awesome and instructive relic of Christ in existence, or it is one of the most ingenious, most unbelievably clever products of the human mind and hand on record. It is either one or the other. There is no middle ground." Historian John Welch. I'm Alan Rabel, and I've been here since 1984. This is my lovely wife who is going to drive this slides tonight. And before I delve into a few people that have helped us to get to this spot, I want to introduce my co-speaker, Jimmy Naughty. Jimmy has a great bio, and Jimmy, go at it.
So good evening, everybody. How are you? Good. So my name is Jim, and my last name is Naughty. I have been involved with the Shroud of Turin ever since I was 6 years old, when I first saw it on National Geographic many, many, many years ago. And I became just completely blown away that this could possibly be the face of Jesus. So I used to go to the Franciscan monastery in Washington, D.C., and while I was there one time, I met a brother. His name was Brother Joseph Pounds, and he was actually at the Vatican in 1978 with Stirp. He held the shroud. So I thought, if I shake his hand, maybe I'll become a relic too, because this man held the cloth that bore the image of Jesus. So I studied with him, and my parents would take me. God rest my father's soul. He's looking down at me now, and he's very proud that all of that was not in vain, because I learned so much from Brother Joe. He studied with Monsignor Ricci at the Vatican, who had studied since the 1930s. And as a gift, before Brother Joe passed away, he gave me a relic of the actual thorn that was in the crown of Christ. And I brought it tonight for anybody that would like to touch a metal to it or pray before it. So it is here. The table has artifacts, and we'll get into all of those later. Please take pictures. I want you to remember this, because Alan and I, we want to bring you Jesus crucified.
Thank you, Jimmy. And much like Jimmy's dad, who passed away, I think you said in 2019, my father passed away in 2020 at the age of 98. And he was really the mentor to our family, my brothers and my only sister. My dad started his own study in 1957 and carried it forward for another 40 years. He spoke over 500 times, mainly in the Bible Belt of North Carolina. A lot of non-Catholic churches, very receptive to this, particularly during this season of Lent. So my dad's inspiration, you'll see it throughout the tape. I also want to mention my good friend, and it's just funny because he actually spoke last year here. Some of you will remember the Rear Admiral Dan O'Toole. Dan and I grew up playing sports together in the backyard together, and lo and behold, the Shroud of Turin brought us back together, and Dan was kind enough to come down from Boston last year. He's very busy at this time, but I'll also mention some of his work, and we give him credit on some of the slides today as well. Jimmy was very humble. I want to say this about Jimmy. He is a blossoming carrier of God's word. I remember when I was just a young person, and I saw my dad do it, and I said, I'll never do that. And here I am. But there are certain talents, and we're blessed to have Jimmy tonight.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. Well, this starts it right off. We dive pretty deep. Something happened, and if you mark it in your notes, if you're taking a few notes just in your phone or something, 1978, STIRP, the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Really, it was the hand of God that brought together about 39 different men of all disciplines of science. And they came together, and it was because of these two gentlemen, Jumper and Jackson. Now, One was from Colorado, one was from the University of Notre Dame, University of Colorado, and they both met at Air Force Academy. And later on in the presentation, Jimmy will talk about a VP8 image analyzer. Now, what the heck is a VP8 image analyzer? Jimmy will explain it, but it took three-dimensional shots, or made three-dimensional shots from the moon when they got them back. And so NASA was, you think back in time and space, NASA was really big back then. But that has a significant role. I like to call it the hand of God. You look at the different sciences that are going on here. These were really photos, and there were thousands of them, I think. Jimmy has the number probably in his head, that these researchers, the STIRP committee, and they were men that weren't necessarily all believers. There were agnostics, there were doubters, but nobody really talked about that. What they talked about was the science. And what we're here tonight for you to decide on is, what is that science? How relevant is it? And as John Paul II said, science and faith should merge. If you ever had the opportunity to go down to JP2 Institute, I think I've heard someone say he's quoted over 23 times that the science that evolves or we have revelation about should play well in hand with our faith. So let's go to the next slide. So we'll have a little fun. I told Jimmy I would do this because this is what my good friend Dan did last year. You are the jury. I shouldn't assume that everyone here is a reborn Christian or a believer. You might be of a different faith. We have an online audience. They could be from Boston to Greenville to St. Louis to California. At least I put those invites out, right? So we don't know, and if things get posted later on, we don't know how a talk like this may affect somebody. We just need to respect where they're coming from. But we'll let God do the work. Here, as the jury, as Dan said, there's documentary evidence, there might be blood evidence, there's pollen evidence, there's sampling, and there was DNA testing even in 2015. And the next slide. Now, Dan also, to use something, talks about common sense. Dan was a trial lawyer. My good friend became a trial lawyer for 24 years and also Rear Admiral Navy judge. And Dan said, I always taught my jury that you have to also tie things together. He gives this great example. And I don't know if you're like me, I always open the blinds in the morning and see if it rains. It hadn't rained in a while, But how do I tell if it rained? I look at the trees, I look at the street, I look a little bit at the sidewalk, I know the spots in my front yard. But if I didn't see all those spots wet, is it my neighbor's sprinkling system? So some things can be tied together. This man next to me, he's going to tie a lot together, Old Testament and New. And the next slide. And we're going to try something here. I wanted you to hear my dad's voice. And I give credit to my brother, Dick, who did a video of that. And let's see if it'll work.
And so to begin, and I take this method of explaining this because I think it has a deeper meaning. And I'd really like to share with you what I consider the very beginning of the revelations of the deeper understanding of the passion and death of Christ as confirmed in the Holy Shroud of Turin. And Turin, the shroud was brought there in the year 1578. It's not really understood as the authentic winding sheet of Jesus, but there were people who looked upon it and somehow the Spirit of God confirmed within their spirit that this was real. It was real throughout the centuries because there was a custodial care of this shroud in the Christian community, but it was not brought to the light of day really in a sense in which it could be studied scientifically, not only scientifically, but rationally, and reach back 1900 years and show us from the evidence, intrinsic evidence of the shroud itself, that it was the authentic winding sheet of Jesus.
Sorry, the sound is a little off. We took a chance there. Okay, and I can adjust that. Yeah, I'll give you a second. So my dad used the term.
And so to begin.
That's okay? Got it. All right. So my dad and Jimmy, I've listened to Jimmy speak even recently last night. The shroud is a representation of the passion and death of Jesus Christ as in the Bible. And that is something that we're going to try to unveil and see what that revelation is all about tonight. Now, here you see that the linen was 14 feet by almost 4 feet. There's a herringbone weave. And Jimmy was kind enough to set up with his friend Joe. Joe, thanks for the help. Jimmy, come up here and I wanted Jimmy, we're just kind of ad-libbing a little bit, but this presentation is just amazing. It's the first time I've seen it other than last night, so it's new to him. So I'll let you just explain.
So I presented last year at my parish, St. Andrew's Catholic Church in Silver Spring, Maryland. And when I was there was a lady, an older lady that had come up to me and she said, I can't stay for the presentation, but I'm going to come back when it's done. I have something for you. So I was thinking, okay, sure. So after the presentation, she came back and she said to me, she said, I used to give talks on the Shroud of Turin. She said, but I'm older now. It's hard for me to get around. And she said, I have a replica of the shroud. Would you like to have it? Just out of the blue. Isn't it funny how God works, right? I see people nodding their head. He's amazing. So this is the first year that I'm actually using this, and God brought it to me so that I could share it with you. And again, it is here for anybody that wants to take pictures. This is exactly what you would see if you were looking at the Shroud of Turin. This is a smaller image. The actual shroud is 14 feet by almost 4.5 feet wide. Okay, so this is just a little bit smaller, but it is identical to what you would see if you went to Turin, Italy. But I was just amazed that this lady out of the blue came up to me and said, I have something for you. And lo and behold, it's a replica of the actual Shroud of Turin. So thank God for that. And thank God that he allowed me to bring that here for you tonight.
Now, as the jury, to bring us back to focus, thank you, Jimmy.
You're welcome.
What do you notice about this? We'll call it a large format poster here. Is the image very clear in the back? Who's been to Turin, Italy and actually seen the shroud? Could you stand up? I want to ask you a question. I'll see how this works with, and could you tell us, Dan, can you help with the mic? Yeah, so I just want to, you can just look at me. So I just want to ask you, was it easy to see the image?
You could see the outline of it fairly clearly, just like you can see here. It's subdued. It's not real prominent from the standpoint of you can see everything, but from here I can very clearly see the image of the face and the back as well as the front.
Great, thank you.
Adrian,
Did anyone have trouble? And ma'am, did you want to add to that? Oh, okay. So I think that, and there was someone else in the back. How was your experience seeing the shroud?
I believe I went twice, and the first time I was able to see it, but the second time there were curtains, so I couldn't see it.
You couldn't see it at all. And what year was that where they had
I
the
can't
curtains?
remember the year, sorry. But it was between 2004, 2007.
Oh, interesting. It might have been, yeah. So in the year I mentioned Stirp, 1978, over 3.4 million people, including my mom and dad, were a part of that toured and saw that exhibit of the shroud. And that was the year that those researchers from America went over, and that in and of itself, how they got there was that you could write a movie on it, because every blockade that could have happened, they had to overcome, including raising the money, including designing their own equipment in that certain room. We see that this was a unique cloth. It was a herringbone weave, and we'll see some slides and micro slides on that. There were faint images, as our people in the audience have shared tonight. And if not obvious, there's a man in there, if you can really start to take a look, and let's go to the next slide. We start to see and hear something that looks bruised, damaged, almost distorted. Now this head is reversed, the feet are up here, head this way, and the feet are down there. It is not exactly centered in that other shroud. Jimmy will talk quite a bit about that. We can start to see blood stains, etc. And we'll go to the next slide. And now you get to see this representation that Jimmy and Joe set up a little bit better. So all I'm trying to do in these slides is show you now side by side. So this is the front and this is the back. Here we see a lot of scraping and scuffing, and Jimmy will get into that. Next slide. And what does Scripture say? From Luke, and taking him down, they wrapped him in a fine linen and laid him in a sepulchre that was hewn in stone, wherein never yet any man had been laid. And the next slide. Now, it's interesting because Giovanni Battista and Jimmy, again, might talk on this, but now you see why it's called a winding sheet. When I was a young man, I always wondered, like this young lady here, why they call it a winding sheet? Because they wrapped it around Christ. It's pretty accurate, except Jesus is in a relaxed position. His feet are side by side. Jimmy's going to probably talk about the body and the stiffness, and he'll term it. And of course, Jesus was naked as he laid on the cross. And the next slide. Now, I thought it'd be important tonight, and I'll do my best, to create, how did the Shroud of Turin get to Turin, Italy? It wasn't always there. So let's start with the year Jesus died, 33 AD. There was a king, Abgar in Edessa, and there was an image there. There was also art that they uncovered, and we see this art in skeletal form, head reversed, almost just like the shroud, in these drawings. Now, I found this word really interesting, a tetradiplon, and that's the folds that are in the shroud. So it was folded over and then folded again and folded a fourth time. So you have this tetradiplon folding. We see that the heads are also outlined in art. Let's go to the next slide. Now I want to tell a little bit about the story of King Abgar of Edessa and the image of Edessa. So what actually happened was King Abgar had leprosy, and he heard of Jesus of Nazareth being the great curer. So he sent a letter down there, and he asked Jesus to come see him. But Jesus said, I'm busy with my ministry, but I will take care of you eventually. Well, what happened was Jesus was crucified, and he died, per the Bible. And the story continued because King Abgar, ended up sending the apostle Thaddeus, and Thaddeus received the shroud, probably from Peter, and brought it back up to King Abgar, and he was healed as a result of touching that shroud. Now, that's through research and through text, and I'll give you in the next slide who was doing a lot of that. Just wanted to give you a snippet. This was well documented, that all of a sudden, that this winding sheet with the face of Jesus Christ was taken up to Edessa, and it became known as the image of Edessa. The Gospel of Hebrews, translated by St. Jerome, talks about it. Eusebius, St. Athanasius, and these are all documented. Evagrius Scholasticus, though, this is a really interesting one, held the shroud up and supposedly protected Edessa from the Persian invasion. And we'll go to the next slide. So the image of Edessa was there till the year 944. And I'm going to do a summary after this because it always was very confusing to me what the history of the shroud and how it got to Turin. But Constantinople, it left Edessa, which was actually modern Turkey, and it went Constantinople, which is also, I think, west of Edessa. And there's documentation that Archdeacon Gregory gave a nice homily. So they know that this is what happened. And this is a quote, imprinted only by the sweat from the face. And they thought it was the true imprint of Christ and embellished from the drops from his own side. Now, from Constantinople, there was the Fourth Crusade. But before it got ransacked and stolen during the Fourth Crusade, there was a knight, again, Robert de Clary, and that knight on every Friday night was in charge of protecting this large winding sheet that had the face of Christ on it. And that was documented. So we'll go to the next slide. So now all of a sudden we're in the Fourth Crusade, and where's the shroud gone? Well, we lost track. We lost track from about the early 1200s, 1205 to about 1355. But then there was more documentation that these Knights Templar in Lorraine, France, had documentation that was dug up by a couple of researchers, Scavone and Wilson, and they documented very clearly that two families, the Charnay family and eventually the Savoy family, were the last two before the Catholic Church was bequeathed it by Umberto III to John Paul II. Now, what actually happened, and we'll go to the next slide. I'm going to try to summarize what I just went through because sometimes it gets a little jumbled. So in 33 AD, Jesus dies. I told you the quick story about King Abgar. He sends St. Thaddeus, one of the 70 early apostles, and they bring it up to Edessa. Spoils of war in about 933 take it up to Constantinople. Now, you know, if you watch some of these old medieval movies, there's all kinds of chaos going on. Wars and trying to protect it in the next best castle, etc. From the Fourth Crusade, however, and we know here, this is where Robert de Clary was, and on Friday evenings, they exhibit it and people venerate it, that cloth, that winding sheet. From here, it gets a little bit iffy, and it went up to Lorraine, but they had great documentation. Even a couple of the Vatican historians have documented it in Lorraine. And what happened up with the de Charny family, Geoffrey de Charny is well noted, and his granddaughter, Margaret, talked him into keeping the shroud in protection. So Geoffrey gave it to his granddaughter. It was his granddaughter, Margaret, and I got from my friend Dan a little bit of the inside. I said, she sold the shroud for 2 castles. It seemed a little mysterious to the Savoy family. But Dan said, no, the backstory on that was she knew that the Savoy family would take good, to use my dad's terms, custodial care of the shroud. She wanted a family that thought that they could protect the true winding sheet of Christ. So there's always background story, and I think it got into Chambray with the Savoy family around 1444. It got to Turin, Italy, as my dad, the video, we're trying to get the sound, but it was about 1578, and it's been there ever since. When it was bequeathed to the John Paul II, the King Umberto asked that it would only stay in Turin, Italy. And the next slide. We'll stop here for just 1 second. No, I'm good to go. So, pardon me? No, we're good. We're good. Thanks. So the real story, so we're in Turin, Italy now. And this was a very prominent man. He was commissioned by the Vatican to take a couple of photos. And he was a lawyer and amateur photographer. His name was Secondo Pia, 1898. It's a pivotal year. And so let's see what he took a look at. He saw this, the face on the shroud. And does it not look like what Jimmy and Joe set up over here? A little bit. He saw this, but he didn't really think. He was actually a non-believer, I believe my dad said, and he didn't know what was going to happen, so he took a photograph of it. Now, back in those days, what did photography look like? It was a box camera, about 14 inches. It had about 12-inch metal plates in it that got developed in their developing room. And let's go to the next slide. And what do you think happened? He saw this face that you have on your card tonight. It was a negative, but it was a positive. This is the face that in Christian belief is the face of Jesus Christ, as in the Bible. Now, we see a number of things in this face, and he was trembling in his boots when he saw it. And what do you think he would have done when that happened, when he developed this? What do you think he would do? He would go to the world and tell them, right? So he made photographic copies of this. And he went to the London Times, the New York Times, the Vatican Press, the media of the day. And what do you think the media of the day did? They thought it was the biggest chicanery, the biggest trick, the biggest hoax in Christianity that he would come up with this. Let's go to the next slide. Jimmy, I'll need your help on this one
Okay.
to tie it in.
Can I get the clicker, Alan?
Yeah.
And can we go back to the other slide?
You got it.
So I'm going to briefly touch on what they discovered with the image of this man. Recent calculations, they have come to measure the man on the shroud, and he's between 6 foot and 6'1", 185 pounds. They said that he was very well muscled and accustomed to hard labor and walking, which we know that Jesus was a carpenter. Joseph was a carpenter. Now, the shroud is not inconsistent because archaeologists near the Dead Sea Scrolls have uncovered bones of Jewish men from the 1st century, and the average height was 5'10" to 5'10.5". So being 6 foot isn't out of the ordinary. A lot of people think, oh, they were very small back then. Clearly, that's not the case. And the shroud shows that, and it also upholds science and archaeology. What they also discovered was that the face of the man at one time was very beautiful. They said that he was a very handsome man. But we see here is there's a lot of damage to the face. We see that there is long hair. It falls to the shoulders, a beard, a mustache. But what we also notice is that the left cheek is swollen. The right cheek is swollen. The right eye is swollen shut. And in the corner of the right eye, the eyelid is torn. They also noticed that there's a swelling on the forehead, a swelling on the chin, and that the nose has been fractured. They also noticed that the beard has a rather irregular shape. On the right side, on the left side, it's full. On the right side, they came to the conclusion that that part of the beard had been ripped out. Let's go back to what Isaiah said when he prophesied the coming of the Messiah. My cheeks I did not hide from them who plucked out my beard. And the Shroud of Turin shows that it is consistent with not only the Gospels, but the Old Testament. And remember, the Old Testament pointed to the coming of the Messiah. The Gospels fulfilled the coming of the Messiah. And the shroud shows that he was the suffering servant, the suffering Messiah. Can we go to the next one? What they noticed on the shroud is that the side of the hair falls to the shoulders, but the back of the hair is actually caught in a ponytail. What they discovered was that these are side locks. In Hebrew, they're known as payas. So this was an Orthodox Jewish male. He had the side locks and the ponytail, which is very typical of ultra-Orthodox men, even to this day. It's consistent with their hairstyle. What they also discovered, and is very faint, is on the back of the shroud, in the area of where the ponytail is, they found a bluish stain. So they uncovered that and figured out what it was. Somebody had dressed the man's hair. Let's go back to when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. When he raised Lazarus from the dead, he was invited to the home of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. And what did Mary do? She anointed his hair. And Judas protested. What you spent on this, you should have given it to the poor. And Jesus rebuked him. Concerned for the poor are you, Judas? You will always have the poor with you, but me you will not. She is preparing me for my burial. And a few days later, the shroud actually shows that somebody, prior to the man's burial, had dressed his hair. And Jesus promised, wherever the Gospels are taught, what she has done, it will be spoken in her honor. And the shroud shows it. Can we go to the next one, please? Here we have the image of the man. This is a positive image. Alan is a tough act to follow because he's so intelligent when it comes to the history of the shroud and where it's been, and he's going to cover more of that again. But this is the positive image that he had talked about previously, that Secundo Pia had taken. And we see that the man is covered with wounds, different types of wounds. And if we can go to the next slide.
I'll hit the history.
There you go.
All right. Yeah, you can hold on.
Okay.
Great. So, Dr. Yves Delage, interestingly enough, so I already talked about how Secundo Pia was ostracized, thrown out of his profession, basically out on the street. But in 1903, Dr. Yves Delage picked up his research, and he said, I think he has a point. This is starting to match up to the historical text of the Bible. Now, Gutenberg printed the Bible, I think, in 1444, I believe, and some of the first editions. So this is 1903. But he got stuck. He needed some help. Dr. Delage was a non-believer. So he called on one of his believing friends who happened to be a part of the French Academy of Sciences. No fly-by-night organization, as my dad would say. They had Louis Pasteur as one of their members. And if you think about back to those times, the French Academy of Sciences was premier in terms of research. So Dr. Paul Vignon collaborated, and they concluded, and they brought it to the Academy of Sciences to peer review. And what did they find out? What do you think happened? They agreed with what Secundo Pia had originally uncovered, that this winding sheet matched the historical figure of Jesus Christ of Nazareth in the Bible. And we'll go to the next slide. But listen to what really happened in the news. What do you think really happened in the media? What do you think happened online? Let's try it. Let's try it with the mic. Dan's got the mic. We'll start it from the start. It's a great thing about.
Man would have been willing to accept it.
Okay.
But if you do think.
So my dad has, of course, you know, when you grow up in a family, you got that voice in your head. Let's see if it comes through. If it doesn't, I'll repeat it.
And Turin, the Shroud was brought there in the year 1578. It's not really understood as the authentic winding sheet of Jesus, but there were people who looked upon it, and somehow the Spirit of God confirmed within their spirit that this was real. It was real throughout the centuries because.
Yeah. It's okay. Try that. I thought this one was. Try it there. Okay.
His findings, and they proclaim the evidence overwhelming for its authenticity. Now, you would have thought when a scientific community had proclaimed it authentic, men would have been willing to accept it and to receive it. But if you do think that, you still don't understand the enemy, that is Satan.
My dad was a big preacher of truth, and he wasn't afraid to say Satan's behind certain things. And he would tell his audiences, as many churches as he went to, that despite the French Academy of Sciences concluding with peer-reviewed research, the media was not going to accept that to be the winding sheet. So the mystery continues. And we'll go to the next slide. Okay, there we go. Now, something happened with Pope Pius the 11th in 1930. He called upon an old man by then, Secundo Pia, to come back. He commissioned a couple of photographers, a couple of, I think a few priests, to dig back up the research of the French Academy and of what Secundo Pia had done. And he realized that this had significant value. And I'm not going to get too much into this, but one thing that I didn't really touch on were these kind of triangulations. And the shroud was in a fire in 1532. And if you remember that line graph, it was in Chambray, France, before it went into Turin, Italy. So I just wanted to point that out. So questions were, could it have been a Renaissance artist? They're still investigating those types of things. Could the brush marks be perfectly stroked on top of the linen in one direction? Do you understand that this, and Jimmy will get into it just shortly, this fine hairline image is of one direction? What artist could have forged that years ago? So, and my dad always said, could photography be understood before it was invented? So that a negative becomes a positive. So really, he was exonerated, Secundo Pia, which is a great end of that story, but he paid the price for truth. And the next slide. I'm going to transition now because you've got a gem on your hand. And much like our stations over there on the wall, And Pat's beautiful prayer, thanks for sharing that with Dan and with the audience tonight. That was great. We're going to go through the medical evidence on the shroud. And again, put your jury hat on. Put your jury hat on. Think about it. Write questions down in your phone for the Q&A afterwards. Jesus being beaten, being questioned, being ridiculed, scourged, the carrying of the cross, the nailing to the cross, and the crucifixion. Jimmy?
Yep. Thank you, Alan. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so we already talked about the beat and battered face. One thing that I also wanted to point out with this face is everybody who has investigated this had said that the man has a very serene look on his face. Somebody who's not angered, somebody who's not frustrated, but somebody who has a face of love. And this is definitely the face of Jesus. We know that, again, these beatings, they came from not only the night before he was taken to Pontius Pilate, because the Gospels tell us that they tied a cloth around his face and buffeted him, meaning they slapped with the palm of their hand, telling him, prophesy, who is it that hit you? We know that the Roman soldiers abused him. One thing that a lot of people question is this triangular shape next to the side of the nose. What they've uncovered is that it's consistent with somebody who was hit right in the face with a stick. So that's how bad the face was battered. Can we go to the next one, please? This is a realistic image of what you would see if you were looking at the face of Jesus. These slides are some of them are rather graphic, but it's the truth of what we would see. And we need to know the truth so that come Good Friday, Jesus' crucifixion will be seared into our hearts and our minds, the one who made perfect atonement. I know some people are taking pictures. So again, we can see the face cold in death, the battered face, the swollen eye, the loss of blood. Can we go to the next one? Now we come to the scourging at the pillar. What exactly was a scourging? Well, scourging was done with the Roman soldiers, and it was to every prisoner. No matter whether you were to be crucified or if you were to be beheaded, you were to be scourged before you were put to death. The difference is the two thieves that were crucified with Jesus, they would have been scourged as they were carrying their cross. Pilate had Jesus scourged first because he wanted to pull on the sensitivities of the Jews to see if they would release him, which they did not. But what we know from the shroud is that the man was taken to a tall pillar and his hands were tied above his head because there's no scourge marks on the forearms. We also know that they fan horizontal on the midsection, they fan parallel across the shoulders, they fan upwards at an angle, and then they fan downwards at an angle on the legs. What this means is that there were two people scourging him. The wounds on the right side are a little bit higher than on the left, meaning that the person that was behind Jesus was taller than his companion on the left. Now, what medieval forger would know to do this? This shows us the reality of this being a real corpse who was truly tortured. What are the effects of scourging? First of all, as we see in the shroud, Jesus was completely naked, so he would have been scourged in a public place naked. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is a realistic image of the scourge wounds, as we would see if we were looking at Jesus. And what we have here are these very dumbbell shapes. And then we see these furrows or these tails. In the image of the right buttocks, they found some tissue on the shroud. And when they discovered what that tissue was, they realized that that part of a man's skin had been flayed away down to the muscle. Roman scourges consisted of what was known as a flagrum. It was a handle that had 2 or 3 leather strips, and at the end of those strips were balls of lead in the shape of a dumbbell. And it is very consistent with the marks that we see. A little further up were embedded sheep knuckle bone. The sheep knuckle bone would tear or furrow the skin, and that's what we see with these tails. where the skin is furrowed. Can we go to the next slide? This is the image of the back of the man on the shroud. And we can see that it is consistent with these dumbbell-shaped wounds from a Roman flagrum. Now, what would the effect of this be? First of all, it would cause, these dumbbell shapes would cause hematomas or contusions under the skin. And as they are repeatedly hit, these hematomas would burst and they would stream blood. The sheep knuckle bone would tear or furrow the skin. It would raise the temperature, so he would be suffering from a fever. He would have bouts of nausea and bouts of dizziness. Not only would it cause bleeding, but it would also cause profuse sweating. So now we're already getting into dehydration and loss of fluids. And we're going to see how that plays in a little bit later in the Passion. Can we go to the next one? This is an image, again, of what we would see as Jesus would have looked buried in the shroud. There is a Spanish sculptor. His name is Professor Juan Manuel Lopez. He's also a medical doctor, and he sculpted these images based on the Shroud of Turin and his 40-some years of investigating the shroud. So he made these as realistic as possible. Can we go to the next one? Now we see above the head, on the forehead, we see the back of the head. We can see this where the shroud shows that the man had the ponytail. And in the locks on the side, we can see trickles of blood. Max Frey, in 1973, he was a Swedish botanist. He was commissioned by the Vatican to come in and see if they could find pollen samples. Well, what he found was over 20 pollen samples on the Shroud of Turin, which come only from Jerusalem in the spring. How about that? No medieval forger is going to know to do this, to go at that time of year to get the correct amount of pollen needed to place it on the burial cloth. But what did he discover in the head region? He discovered pollen grains from the acacia tree. The acacia tree looks like a weeping willow, and it has long, pliable branches. But on those branches are armed with thorns that grow in pairs. One is straight and one is slightly curved. They're white in color, but they grow from 3 to 5 inches in length. This was the crown of thorns. And what we see in art, we see like the little circlet and the little rose bush thorns. These were massive thorns that cut and tore the head. And it was an entire cap, because what they were doing is they were mocking the Jews whose high priest wore a mitre. Our pope, our bishops, and our cardinals wear mitres. So they were mocking the high priest. So this crown would have just been a bushel of thorns that they gathered and placed on his head. Imagine thorns that are 3 to 5 inches in length, tearing your skull. And we're going to get into the pain that he would have felt with that. But what we see in this picture is that this head is covered with approximately 70 wounds from the crown of thorns. What I have here on the table is a replica of the acacia thorn and what the crown would have looked like. Before I go into the pain that he would have felt, I want to show you how the Shroud of Turin ties in to the Old Testament.
Jimmy, may I just take that on your behalf, or I'll just take it down the aisle?
Yeah, it's a little delicate, so
Oh, okay.
yeah. I
won't
think if you hold it from the bottom.
Okay, great.
Yeah, there you go.
Now, Jimmy made this. He's very humble about it, but he made this and just thought you'd see the length. Jimmy, what's the name of this thorn? I know you know it.
So it comes from the acacia tree.
Yeah.
And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie this into you, okay? If we go back to the Old Testament, when God commanded Moses to make the Ark of the Covenant to house the 10 Commandments, the manna from heaven, and the rod of Aaron, do you know what God told him to use? The tree in Hebrew is known as shittim. It's the acacia tree. 2,000 years later, the acacia tree, which was used for the Ark of the Covenant, was used as the crown of thorns to crown the head of the one who said, I am the commandments, I am the bread of life, and I will sit at the right hand of the power of God. So the Old Testament becomes a New Testament, and the shroud ties it all together. How many people here have ever had a toothache? Yes, right? And you want to ram your head into the wall just to relieve the pain. I hate going to the dentist. But with a toothache like that, you want them to drill it, fill it, or pull it out. What is happening is that tooth is hitting the trigeminal nerve. It's a nerve that runs all through the head, the scalp, the face, the back of the head. These thorns would pierce the trigeminal nerve. So Jesus would have one massive migraine, and every tooth in his head would hurt. The pain would run down the sides of his nose, behind his eyes, into his forehead, the top of the head, into the jaw, and into the teeth. And every time he was pushed, kicked, punched, prodded, those thorns would pierce and inflame that trigeminal nerve. It was massive suffering. What they also discovered, pathologists have looked at this and they've said, this is blood from a vein. This is blood from an artery. So that's how long these thorns were to pierce the arteries and the veins. Now imagine how profusely the scalp bleeds. The man's face would be covered in pain and blood, and now he's losing even more fluid. And we're going to tie that end as we get closer to the crucifixion. This is a realistic image of what Jesus would have looked like with the streams of blood coming from the crown of thorns. What they noticed also was this blood is running in one direction. Medical doctors and pathologists, they looked at this and like, wait a minute, all the people we've seen bleed, blood trickles, and it zigzags. Somebody had wiped his face. So we go back to church tradition in the Stations of the Cross that Veronica took her veil and wiped the face of Jesus. And the Shroud of Turin clearly shows that his face was wiped. And we're going to get into why that blood only stayed in one direction when we get to the carrying of the cross. Again, we see the puncture wounds. We see reflex contraction. What is reflex contraction? Does anybody know? Neither did I until I read up on it and found out. Reflex contraction means that your face, it wrinkles when you're in pain or when you're suffering. And what happened was the pain was so intense that as Jesus raised his eyebrows, number one, he needed to squint to be able to see because of the scourging. He was left dizzy and nauseous. And he was losing fluid. So in order to see, he would have to do this. And he would have to squint from the pain. The blood coagulated on his forehead through those wrinkles in the form of a number 3. God left his signature, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. There were 3 languages written on the sign. 3 people were crucified that day. Jesus came back to life on the 3rd day. 3 sets of people went to see him when he was born. Angels, shepherds, and wise men. And here again, God has left on the Shroud of Turin my signature of 3. Isn't God something? Can we go to the next one, please? Now I'm going to briefly go through Roman crucifixions and what crucifixions are not. And then I'm going to show you how he carried the cross. Roman crucifixions were something that the Romans had perfected. They got it from the Persians. And as we know, Romans were perfect engineers. So they created something that was easy to assemble and easy to disassemble. It was not these tall, lofty crosses that we see in art. Roman crosses were actually low to the ground. The upright beam was probably about 7 feet. So a man who was 6 foot could touch the top of it pretty easy. They were known as a stipes. They were left permanently in the ground of execution. The prisoner only carried the cross beam. These crosses were used over and over and over. So they were weather beaten. They had other people's blood and body fluids on them. And outside of Israel, when people in other countries, through the Romans, were crucified, they were left to die and rot on the cross. The Romans would come and knock the bones off, and wherever the bones landed, that's where the person was buried. But in Israel, because of the sensitivity of the Jews, after death, they would remove the prisoners from the cross. And we see that happen to Jesus, and the shroud shows it. Roman crosses, and this goes all the way back to 1st century, in the catacombs in Rome, there are paintings with the early Christians of a capital T, known as a tau. Archaeology has also shown that this was a type of cross that Romans crucified their victims on, was a capital T cross. So it wasn't the plus sign that we see, it was a capital T that Christ was crucified on. That's how Jesus appeared to St. Francis of Assisi. And that's why St. Francis adopted the tau cross. But let's go back again real quick to the Old Testament. When God was punishing Egypt, he said to the Jews, I will pass over you if you mark your doorpost with the blood of the Lamb. Do you know, I have a friend who's a Jews for Jesus, and he explained this to me. He said, in the original Hebrew, the Bereshit, it says, mark your doorpost with tau. 2,000 years later, the Lamb was crucified on the tau. Isn't God something? How it's all connected. As we can see, the vertical beam was constantly left in the ground, and the people only carried the horizontal beam. Can we go to the next one? Now, what we see here is a typical Roman cross, the capital T. And this is the way Jesus would have actually carried the cross beam. And I'm going to demonstrate it for you because I brought a cross beam. And I'm going to show you how he carried it, and then I'm going to tell you exactly what happened to him based on what the shroud tells us. So if I could get one more volunteer. This is about the length of an actual Roman crossbeam. The one that Jesus carried probably would have been about 75 pounds. It was weathered, it was beaten, and on the bottom of it, it had a hole known as a mortise hole. When the person was laid on the ground, they would be nailed. No prisoner ever crucified by a Roman was tied to the cross. They were all nailed. They would have been nailed. 2 soldiers would have lifted the beam up, set it on that upright beam, and the person would be left on a capital T. How did he carry it? Well, I'm going to demonstrate that for you. Thanks, Alan. The prisoner would carry the crossbeam in this way. One end of the beam would be tied to the ankle. The other end of the beam would be tied to the prisoner in the front. And they would have been marched through the streets. Remember, I said earlier that the 2 thieves would be scourged on the way. So as they're writhing in pain, they're pulling the crossbeam. And the one who's the weakest at this point and had suffered the most in the end, or the back of the line, would get the worst of this. So as he's carrying it, he would be in this bent position. And as they're pulling, Jesus is being jolted. Finally, he falls on one knee. Then he falls on the second knee, and then he goes down face first. His hands are tied, so there's nothing to brace himself from falling. He's going to fall on his face. The beams were tied together because they were like handcuffs. That way they couldn't use the beam to knock at Roman soldiers or get away. So they were tied together and led to the place of execution. All right. Thank you. Okay. So again, in this model, we can see where Jesus is tied at the ankle. His beam is tied to the ankle of the person in front of him. Those 2 beams are tied together, and they're led to execution. What would be the effect of this? Well, number one, I already told you, the swelling on the forehead, the fracture of the nose. If you can't brace yourself, you're going to fall face first. What we also discovered about 10 years ago in the Shroud of Turin is that the man on the shroud suffered from a dislocated shoulder. They noticed that the right arm was a little bit longer, and they realized that that shoulder had been popped out of place. Remember, a 75-pound beam falling on your back is going to separate the teres major, minor, the rhomboids, and the lats. It also separated his neck. On the right side of the face of the man, they noticed that the right eye droops and the right mouth droops. He was suffering from facial paralysis, and that's caused from the pulling of the muscles of a dislocated shoulder. Hence, Simon of Cyrene was called in to carry the crossbeam. Because I want you to picture this, when you're doing Stations of the Cross on Good Friday, and when we see the first, the second, and the third fall, let's remember that on that third fall, when Jesus got up, he had to walk like this, because this is what happens with a dislocated shoulder. This is the Son of the living God, who became the Lamb of God. We see the shoulder blades on the back of the shroud, and inside of this blue circle, we see what's this chafing or excoriations of the skin. This was carried from the cross being carried, the rough wood. They also, embedded in parts of the shroud, found splinters. So not only did this beam shift, but it also slid down his back. And it cost him quite a bit for us. But they wondered why it didn't alter the dumbbell-shaped wounds. Well, we have to remember in the Gospels, it says that they took the cloak off of him and put his own clothes back on and led him out. So the robe, his seamless robe, was a buffer that allowed us to continue to see these dumbbell-shaped wounds, but to also see the way that he carried the cross, diagonal, high on the right and low on the left. How many people are familiar with the tunic of Argenteuil? The tunic of Argenteuil has been in church history since probably the 700s. And it's believed to be the seamless robe of Jesus. And it's kept in Argenteuil. And it actually fit a man who was about 6 foot. It's made of wool, and it was sort of a brick red or a faded maroon color. But what they noticed was that the back of it was severely stained with blood. When they investigated, they found that it was AB positive, which is the same blood type on the Shroud of Turin. Can we go to the next slide? Can we go to one after this one, I think? Yes. So this is the tunic. This is what's left today of the tunic of Argenteuil. When they took it and they superimposed it over the back of the shroud, they matched up all the blood stains of where that crossbeam would have shifted and slid and left its mark. Can we go to the next slide? This is dyer's matter. They found that that tunic has dyer's matter, and it's also woven in one piece. In modern day Israel, they still take wool and use dyer's matter. And this is what it would have looked like. And this probably would have been about the color of Jesus's robe. So the shroud is consistent with the Gospels, and the Gospels are consistent with science, and science is consistent with what they still do today in Israel. Isn't it something? Google tunic of Argenteuil. It's a fascinating relic, and it's one that's not really mentioned too much, but it's such a beautiful relic. Can we go back to the dirt evidence? So now we have the dirt evidence. We see that the knees are skinned, particularly the left, meaning that the man on the shroud is right-handed. They found dirt on the tip of the nose, the chin, and the forehead. They also found it on the bottom of the feet. And what they found was dirt that's called travertine aragonite. Travertine aragonite is the component of dirt found in Jerusalem. So that means that this man and this cloth was in Jerusalem. And Alan will get to this in a little bit, but my question before we get to that is this. What medieval forger is going to know to go to Jerusalem, scoop up some dirt, put it on the Shroud of Turin, and say, ha, 500 years later, when they have the technology, they're going to find this. Can we go to the next one? Now we get to the climax, folks. This was the mission for you and for me. Nailed to the cross. Franco Zeffirelli did a beautiful movie called Jesus of Nazareth. Franco Zeffirelli was a historian. So he actually studied Roman crucifixions, and he was the first one to portray on film Jesus carrying the crossbeam. And he did an accurate job. They would have placed him on the ground, they would have nailed him, and then two soldiers on either end would have lifted it and placed it on the top of that upright beam, forming a capital T. Can we go to the next one? Now we see in this circle the hands and we see the feet. But what we notice is that these wounds are not in the palm of the hand. They're actually in the wrist. Dr. Pierre Barbet in the 1930s had studied the Shroud of Turin, and he actually took cadavers and crucified them because he wanted to see what the effect would be on a body. And what he found was when you put a nail through the palm of the hand and suspend somebody, they rip. Especially somebody the size of Jesus, who was 6 foot and 185 pounds. He was a big man. So what he discovered was if you take a nail and you put it through the wrist, there's 4 bones that make a circle. It's called destot space. If you drive it through there, a person will hang securely and it'll bear the weight. But it's also the worst place to drive a nail because it severs or it partially severs the median nerve. How many people have sciatica? Yeah. So if you sever the median nerve, it's the same as sciatica. It's this burning, searing sensation up the arm and into the chest. What I have up here is a replica of a Roman nail. This would be driven into the wrists. The pain associated with that is you would be suspended from your nerves on an already dislocated shoulder. Yes, ma'am.
What would prevent him from having the skin and the wrist ripped out and being nailed from gravity pulling him down other than the ropes like that? Would he have to have more than one set of ropes, one ear?
No, because this nail actually would fit. So if you have these 4 bones of the wrist, that nail actually sits in those 4 bones so that you would be suspended basically from your bones and from your nerves. Can we go to the next one? So we see the nail wound, but we also notice that there's no thumbs. And what Dr. Pierre Barbet discovered was when you drive a nail into a median nerve, the thumb automatically draws into the palm of the hand and the fingers curl into a claw. So Jesus' hands would have been paralyzed in this position until death, no longer able to use his fingers. Can we go to the next one? This is a realistic image of what the nails would have looked like. This is consistent with science and it's consistent with medicine. I know in the Gospels, Jesus said to Thomas, put your finger into the holes of my hands. Remember, Jesus didn't speak English. He spoke Aramaic. And there is no word for wrist. In 1968, in Gavit Matar, Israel, archaeologists discovered a crucified victim. They found his bones, the nails still in his feet. And what they discovered when they looked at his forearms, that the nail was in between the bones, just like the Shroud of Turin. Can we go to the next one? This is an image of how on the Shroud of Turin, the hands would be crossed over the pelvis. We can see again destot space. We can see this hole in the wrist. And we can see some blood patterns here, which we're going to get to in a minute. Can we go to the next one? Again, we see that the thumbs are flexed. We can see that this arm, again, is longer than the left arm due to that dislocated shoulder. And can we go to the next one? Now we get to the feet. The feet were nailed flat to the upright beam. There was no footrest, as we see in art or pictures. So the feet were pointed, and the left was placed over the right, and one single nail pierced the plantar nerve. So now he's suspended by two nerves, the nerves in his feet and the nerves in his arms. And we're going to get to that in a minute. We can see on the shroud the bottom of the right foot, and we can partially see the left. On the positive image, we can see it much clearer. We can see the knees are bent. We can see that the feet are pointed, and that the left is over the right because it's frozen in rigor mortis. This is an image of what the feet would have looked like as they were nailed to the upright beam. This is what it would look like in the shroud as it was buried. We can see the wounds in the knees. We can see that the left foot is over the right, and we can see the bottom of the foot. We can see the hole in the sole of the foot. This is a realistic image of Jesus crucified. You can see the scourge wounds, the cap of thorns, a capital T cross, the nails are in the wrist, the left foot is over the right, and the knees are flexed. The only difference with this crucifix is the fact that in reality, Jesus would have been crucified naked. According to Judaism, life is in the blood. So anything that a person bleeds on in a tragic death has to be buried with you. And being that the man in the shroud was buried naked, he suffered and died naked. The Virgin Mary appeared to St. Bridget of Sweden, and St. Bridget of Sweden had visions of the Virgin's life. And the Virgin Mary said to her, she said, when my son was crucified, she said, as they led him to be scourged, she said, I beheld my son. As they stripped him of his clothes, he stood naked as though he were born. And when they attached him to the pillar, the first lash I fainted. And when I awoke, I saw my son covered in blood. But my son was humiliated and would not even look me in the eye because he stood thus naked and scourged. So let us remember the humility in which Christ suffered his wounds. And just one thing before I go on. All the people that have looked at the shroud, medical doctors, pathologists, crime scene investigators, there's one thing that they have not been able to discover, and that is they could not find a belly button. The first Adam also didn't have a belly button, and neither did Eve, because she was created from a rib. So perhaps the second Adam also didn't have a belly button. Isn't that something? I had mentioned that, and somebody said to me, I can't wrap my head around that. I said, well, let me ask you something. This man walked on water, turned water to wine, raised a dead man after 4 days, and you think a belly button's an issue. The Virgin Mary also said to St. Bridget, do not think that I bore my son like every other woman. I had no labor pain. We entered the grotto and I began to pray. And she said, my son was born, beautiful and pure. So the birth was miraculous. So was the conception. And so were the 9 months that he was in the womb of the Blessed Mother. And this in no way invalidates his humanity because it didn't invalidate Adam's humanity. Now we get to blood evidence from a side wound. We know that the first thief and the second thief had their legs broken. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, so they pierced his side. On the forearms of the shroud, there are 2 different trickles of blood, meaning that the arms were in 2 different positions. Suspended from the cross, in order to breathe, he would have to pull up and drop. Pull up and drop. As he pulled up, the muscle spasms in his thighs and in his calves would cause him to drop. The muscle spasms in his chest, his shoulders, and his biceps would cause him to have to pull up for 3 hours. Dr. Frank Zugibe in the 1980s also crucified people, but he crucified live people. He asked his patients, would you volunteer? And they said, sure. He wanted to see what would happen. So he placed them on crosses and he hooked them up to an EKG machine and he checked their CO2 levels. After 12 minutes, their heart rate went up here and their oxygen level dropped. So they would have to pull up quickly. After 12 minutes, they would have to drop. In 1 hour, he had to take them off of the cross because their heart rates were this and their CO2 was like this. Nobody took Jesus off of the cross. That's how he suffered for 3 hours. They also noticed that the right elbow was severely bent, meaning that there was a certain position that Jesus ended up in when he died. And I'm going to show you that position. We know that he said 7 beautiful things while he struggled to breathe. Remember, pulling this median nerve, a dislocated shoulder, and pulling up on the plantar nerve of the feet. And what was the first thing he said? Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And he would drop. Today you will be with me in paradise. And he dropped. Woman, behold your son. Behold your mother. And he would drop. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? And drop. I thirst. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. It is finished. On Good Friday, let's remember this twisted and wretched figure. Twisted in death for us. This was his final position. Knees in one direction, hips in the other direction, and a bent arm resting on a dislocated shoulder. This is the image of our God. Can we go to the next slide? This is a realistic image of the side wound. The Shroud of Turin shows that there is blood and fluid. John called it water, but we know what it is today. It's pulmonary fluid. The severe beating of the chest, falling on the ground, being punched and kicked, struggling for air, caused fluid to back up in the lungs. And it would back up into the sac around the heart, the pericardium sac. The lance would pierce the lung, pierce the sac, and pierce the heart. And blood and water would come out. Can we go back to that one slide? We can see in this circle the fluid, pulmonary fluid. And we can see that the blood is trickling, meaning it's post-mortem. The man is dead. If he was alive, the blood would spurt. So the shroud shows us that it's consistent with the gospel. This man was pierced after death. Eucharistic miracles. There was one in Argentina a couple years ago before Pope Francis became Pope. Somebody had dropped the Eucharist. Well, the priest picked it up and he put it in water for it to dissolve, which is correct. The next day, when he went back to the tabernacle, the host was bleeding. So he took it to then Bishop, who became Pope Francis. He decided, let's do a medical investigation. And what they found was the blood was AB positive, but the host had turned into tortured heart muscle, meaning it came from a young man who was suffering a heart attack. We know that the lance pierced his heart, but I ask you, what broke his heart? Was it the trauma? Was it the lance? Or was it our sins? I think it was all three. Our sins and the physical heart that was pierced by a lance. Let's draw closer to Jesus this Good Friday. Alan and I, our hope is to bring you tonight Jesus crucified. And I hope that we've done that. And remember the tremendous suffering for us, our perfect atonement. Can we go to the next one, please? We see this blood that pooled in the kidney area. What happened was, it was a dual celebration, Passover and Sabbath. So the Jews, they didn't want to become unclean by touching a corpse. So they took the nail out of the feet, they rocked the patibulum back and forth and took it down while he's still nailed to it. And somebody took a cloth around the ankles, around the waist, and two people held either end of the patibulum and carried him to the tomb. As they turned him horizontal, the blood from the side wound coagulated around that cloth band that they used to carry him and left it on the Shroud of Turin. Can we go to the next one? This is from Monsignor Ricci, who studied, and this is how they would have removed Jesus from the cross. Not the way that we see it in art. Can we go to the next one? Alan reached or touched on this a little while ago. The body was placed on one end of the cloth and the other end was folded over. And then according to John, he was wrapped, according to the Jews, in strips of cloth. A cloth would have been on the outside of the shroud, tied around the ankles, the knees, the waist, and the neck. And we're going to get to that in a minute. This is how Jesus would have been placed in the tomb after he had been placed in the Shroud of Turin. And we can see the cloths binding him, as we know when he said he raised Lazarus, unbind him. Jesus was also bound inside of his shroud. We know that there was rigor mortis. We see it in the bent knees. We see it in the flexed feet. We can see that the thorax is hyperextended because of that drawing for air. And we can see that the head is tilted forward and to the right. Remember I said to you that somebody had wiped his face and the blood was only in one direction after they had wiped his face? A man with a dislocated shoulder can no longer turn his head. So any drop of blood would go in one direction. And the shroud shows it. Can we go to the next one? This is St. Catherine's Monastery. Alan, do you want to take this one or? Okay. So this is the Pantocrator. It was between 548 and 565. It's a beautiful picture. It's at Mount Sinai. If we can go to the next one. It bears a striking resemblance to the shroud, meaning somebody had access to the Shroud of Turin to paint this picture. So this is way before the 1300s, and it's consistent with the history that Alan just talked about. Here's the Justinian coin, minted 692 to 695, 180 points of congruence. Again, somebody had access at this time period to the Shroud of Turin and minted a coin. We see that the shroud has 3D properties. That was discovered by accident. The U.S. Air Force scientist, the VP-8 image analyzer, As they were investigating the shroud, they found out that this image is 3D. Not only is it a negative that becomes a perfect positive, but it's not flat. It has a 3D property. So they did some investigating, and they found the face of the man of the shroud is now starting to come to life. It's a real corpse. They tried to do it with a photo of Pope Pius. They tried to make it negative, they tried to give it 3D qualities, and clearly we can see that it failed miserably. Because nobody can do what the hand of God does. So again, we see that the image was formed after the blood. There's no pigment or dye. It doesn't penetrate the fibers. It only penetrates the fibers the width of a human hair. It doesn't burn. The body distance is proportional from the linen. There's no decomposition, meaning that this body was in this cloth between 36 to 48 hours, and then it was gone. And no blood clots were broken, meaning that the person was not taken out physically. And we see rapid oxidation. How many people know what rapid oxidation is? I didn't. I'm glad you guys know. Well, if you want to know what rapid oxidation is, go home and move a piece of furniture from your carpet. See how the sun bleaches it or makes it lighter? That's rapid oxidation. So there was a burst of energy or a burst of light that oxidized the cloth and left an image. What they discovered was it took approximately 3 minutes to leave an image the width of a human hair, and it was 34 trillion watts of energy. Unheard of. Can we go to the next one? So again, we see the Shroud of Turin. The man is resting in death. The hands are crossed. We can see the wounds. We can see the rigor mortis. Alan touched on what these were. These were sewn on by the Poor Clare nuns in 1532 to cover the burn marks. But in looking at this, you know what it reminds me of? Read the book of Revelations when John had his vision. I saw the Son of Man, clothed in white, and his face was shining like the sun, and he stood in between two candlesticks. Look at that. Is that a fulfillment of Revelations in the shroud? Maybe. But it's all connected. Can we go to the next one? This is a realistic image of what Jesus would have looked like as he was buried in the shroud. And later on, if anybody wants to take pictures of these slides, we can make arrangements. Can we go to the next one? The Siderium of Oviedo. How many people know what that is? So it's a face cloth This is a replica. This cloth is stained with blood and pulmonary fluid. There's 3 different stains from 3 different time periods. Pathologists, I'm sorry, they wanted to see it.
I can hold it for you, Jim.
Oh, okay, thanks, Alan. 3 different blood stains, 40% blood, 60% pulmonary fluid. It ran out of the man's nose and mouth. The first set was in a vertical position. The second set was on a side position. And the third set was face down. They believe that this face cloth was used to cover his face after death. Remember, his eyes would be open, his mouth would be open. Women were standing around, his mother was there. So, like we today, we cover the face of a dead body. They did the same thing. And as they were covering his face in death, as they moved the body a little bit to cover the face, blood and pulmonary fluid would pour out of the mouth and the nose, and that was the first stain. The second stain was when they were rocking the patibulum back and forth and lowering him to the ground. The third stain was when they got to the sepulcher and they removed him from the cross to pick him up to carry the body in. Can we go to the next slide? This is a clearer image, a bigger image. They found that this cloth covered the face of Jesus because they superimposed it over the Shroud of Turin and it matched 100%. Can we go to the next one? This is what it would have looked like. A crime scene investigator looked at the sudarium and he said the first set of stains, the person was in a vertical position with their head covered at least 45 minutes to an hour. So Jesus hung on the cross dead for 35 minutes to an hour before he was removed. And this is consistent with the Gospels because remember, it says they had to go to Pontius Pilate to get permission. Then Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus had to get in on the scene. They had to go buy the spices for burial. And the sudarium shows it. The other cloth. Can we go to the next one, please? The resurrection. We know the story didn't end with the crucifixion. 34 trillion watts of energy, and the man was gone. Let me give you a little backstory before we go on. Alan, can I see that just real quick? Yep. Once they got to the tomb, this cloth would be folded. Placed under the chin and tied at the top of the head. That was to keep the mouth closed. And it shows on the Shroud of Turin because you see that the face is rather square. It's because of that chin band. In John, it says Peter and John ran to the tomb. John got there first. He was younger, quicker, maybe. When Peter looked in, they entered. And Peter saw the grave cloths and that which was about the head folded up in a place by itself, and they believed. My friend who is a Jew for Jesus, I asked him, what's the significance of this? Because clearly it was mentioned for a reason. He said, Jim, let me tell you what that means. He said, when a master was done at the table, he would take his napkin and he would place it on a plate. And the servant knew not to take the plate away. To take the plate away, the master was done. But if he took that napkin and he folded it a certain way and put it to the side, the servant would look at this and he would say, oh, the master is coming back. So Jesus himself got out of the shroud, removed that sudarium chin band, folded it in a place by itself, letting Peter know, I'm coming back. Isn't that something? Mm-hmm. Can we go to the next one? This is what the chin band would have looked like as Jesus was buried in the shroud. Okay. So yeah, anyway, we can see that it's around the face and then the shroud would have been drawn over. Okay, can we go to the next one? The veil of Manoppello. How many people are familiar with the veil of Manoppello?
I'll switch with you.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Here you go.
Thank you.
You bet.
So the veil of Manoppello is kept in Abruzzo, Italy. Pope Benedict XVI actually went to visit the veil of Manoppello in 2006. And when he prayed in front of it, he said, I've just seen the face of Jesus. Well, let me explain what this is. According to Jewish burial, when a person is buried in a shroud, there's a cloth that's placed outside of the shroud over the face. And they still do it to this day, the Orthodox Jews. This face cloth was placed over the shroud. This is the moment of the resurrection. As Jesus left his image on the shroud, the corpse, he left an image of himself coming back to life. The wounds are healing. and the pupils are dilated. You know what that means medically? Every morning that we wake up, our pupils dilate. The man is waking up. This cloth, they investigated the cloth, and it's known as byssus silk. It's as thin as a woman's nylon. You could hold it up and read a newspaper through it. There's no paint, no dye. It has the same qualities as the tilma of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And it shimmers like bird feathers. It's iridescent. Because the cloth is so thin, the face does not have 3D properties. So the face looks flat and distorted. But we're going to get to that in a minute. Can we go to the next slide? And I just wanted to point out, we can see that the face is healing, but we can see a mustache and a beard. We can see that the hair is dark. And we can see that the eyes are beautiful. So they took it and they superimposed it over the Shroud of Turin, and now it's beginning to match. Now it's getting 3D properties. The Divine Mercy. St. Faustina had this image painted in 1931. And she said, "Who can paint you, O Lord, as beautiful as you are?" And she cried about it. She didn't like it. Well, Jesus appeared to her and he says, "You're right, it's not that good." But it's not in the colors and it's not in the brush strokes, but the grace. So they took the Divine Mercy, and this was by accident in the early 2000s. Can we go to the next one? They found that the veil of Manoppello matches the face on the Divine Mercy. They made another accidental discovery. The Divine Mercy is identical to the face on the Shroud of Turin. It matches 100%. Can we go to the next one? So they took the full-length image, the one that St. Faustina had painted is full length. They superimposed it over the shroud, and they found that the hair, the beard, the length of the nose, the lips, all line up. The shoulders are identical, and in the Divine Mercy, Jesus is stepping forward with his left foot. It matches the left foot of the Shroud of Turin. They also noticed that where he's opening the garment, his heart is in line with the heart of the man on the shroud. And they also discovered that the red ray that comes out slightly crosses over the side wound. Can we go to the next one? How many people are familiar with AI, artificial intelligence? So artificial intelligence got involved a couple years ago, and this was just recent. They took the veil of Manoppello and they gave it 3D properties. They took the Divine Mercy face, left it as it is. Then they took the Shroud of Turin. They took all the wounds out. They took the swellings out. They put the veil of Manoppello, the Shroud of Turin, and the Divine Mercy together. And guess what they found? The true face of Jesus Christ. Behold the Lamb of God. And St. Faustina was correct. Who can paint you as beautiful as you are? With all three face cloths, we finally get to see what Jesus would have looked like 2,000 years ago. If anybody later after the presentation would like to take a picture of this, I think we could pull it back up. So I want to thank all of you for allowing me to stand up here and talk tonight. I hope that I have brought you Jesus crucified, and I hope that I have shared these wounds with you as best as I could. My prayer is for all of us to be closer to Jesus this Good Friday. My prayer is also to dedicate tonight's session to the poor souls in purgatory. I'm now going to turn it back over to Alan, who's going to finish the presentation, but I would just like to say thank you so much, and may God bless you all. Thank you.
That was pretty amazing, wasn't it? I told you. So jury, did you come to see the face of Christ? Well, in AI, perhaps you have, but maybe not so fast. Remember what my dad said, the devil's pretty strong out there. Let's go to the next slide. Oop. And we have a stop. It's all good. Why did you look among the dead for the living? Jimmy described the light so poignantly. My dad at the time did not have all the technology that Jimmy studied. My dad said there was visible light and there was invisible light. And what fell into the realm of invisible light but radiation? We know in World War II there was an image, a very sad image of a young person basically plastered to the wall because of that atomic bomb blast. My dad always insinuated that that image could have been caused by that radiation effect. But where is the light? What do we believe tonight? Do we look among the dead for the living, and in our own lives? Next slide. I just wanted to do one quick sidestep. Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a vision of what some of the tombs. There's still archaeologists. I even caught something a couple of years ago where the archaeologists out of UNC Charlotte had been over, and they're still finding amazingly artifacts in some of the tombs. And Jimmy's probably up on a lot of that. But do pray for the city of Jerusalem. Much like modernization, they're cutting new highways right around it, since my wife and I had the pleasure of going over there in 2018. And, I'm worried about it. Some of the great history that could be uncovered. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. Now, not so fast. In 1988, guess what came out? And what happened in 1988 with the carbon-14? How many heard about it? Was it a forgery? Yeah, what date did they come up with? They came up with the date around 1200. Now, these three gentlemen, and they had three different labs, and they took a sample. Now, let's think about it. We've been here a long time, but they took the sample from an outside part of that shroud or linen, and it was probably somewhere that had been handled. Remember that timeline? And it probably could have even been on one of the patched areas. They did not take different samples throughout the shroud. So there's been, since 1988, a lot of data that's come out. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that over nearly 50% of carbon dating at archaeology sites is deemed unacceptable. My good friend Dan again said, hey, there was a McDonald's wrap that was declared year 340 some AD or something like that. But I think there was one significant fact or a number of facts that Jimmy went through tonight. And when he was talking about Justinian coin around the 600, when he was talking about some of the ancient art, and that dated Christ Pantocrator, that art was well before the 1200s. And in fact, Roman crucifixion was declared illegal. Do you remember what year? It was 300s. So how could you have carbon-14 data? Now, some going full circle back to a couple of the young men and at STURP, now older experienced scientists, they tested the experimental data that these gentlemen went through, and they disproved it because they found all types of pollen and things that basically contaminated the sample. But I just think, from a personal standpoint, the church wasn't going to allow them to cut into the shroud and get all kinds of fibers. By now, and Jimmy will even take the Q&A, things are starting to even fade on the shroud itself. We'll go to the next slide. So this is some of the art I was referencing, predated by 168. Here's that 3 effect right there that Jimmy so nicely outlined tonight. And the next slide. Something I just want to point out, and we'll wrap it up just in a couple of slides. Now, this X-ray dating, and it's actually called wide angle almost, or wide X-ray dating, is relatively new research. And actually, a friend from the parish sent this to me after the talk last year, and I read on it, ran it by my friend Dan. So remember that the Shroud of Turin over here is a cellulose. It's that tweed. And it did not have cotton fiber. Picture it almost like a spaghetti fiber. Well, that disintegrates over time. X-rays measure that disintegration, guess what they found out? That the shroud itself was about 2,000 years old. So if we take 2,000 away from 2023, we're right in the time of Christ. And the next slide, oh, we'll go back one, Gina. And you can see about 2,000 years old here on the date, okay? And all I wanted to say about this, just to kind of, since you're my jury, and you've got to disseminate and think about all the facts tonight, Jimmy did a great job of just outlining how thin a layer this is. But nobody's been able to replicate this image exactly. They've tried in labs, but they haven't exactly replicated. One thing, and we've been asked this in Q&A, and Jimmy so well outlined it, as I could listen to him night after night, because I learned something every night. The blood, because Jesus was crucified and was wrapped in the cloth, the blood saturates, if not super saturates, through that cloth. In fact, when I was holding up the Ovidiad Sudarium, you could see the blood almost on the opposite side as I was holding it up here. So the blood is throughout the fibers, and Dr. Heller, I think I have his book over here. My dad was a huge fan of Dr. Heller, and he was at Yale University. He was the first one that actually proved there was AB blood type. Now, AB blood type was only found over in the Palestine, was pretty dominant in these tombs over in Palestine area. And he proved it in his lab at Yale when they handed him some of the microscope slides and samples they brought back from the Stirp Committee in 1978. So I just wanted to point that out. And this is a super light image, and it's on top of all these fibers. It's just absolutely incredible. But I got to admit, nobody's actually tried nobody's replicated it exactly. Okay, the next slide. Jimmy outlined all these so well. And the next slide. So, the question. Jimmy brought it up in a AI, artificial intelligence, 3D image. I bring it up tonight. And I was kind of asking myself, as we prepare for the talk, what brings us here? Whose face is this? Whose face do you say it is? Fra Angelica, great Renaissance artist, cried at his chisel because, at his palette as he tried to paint this face, for he couldn't. Michelangelo dropped his paintbrush. He could not replicate the compassion and the love of this face. And the great Michelangelo, my dad said, threw his knife because he could not sculpt such a face. You've been great to hang in there with us. Jimmy, you are absolutely fantastic tonight. I learned something every time I'm here. On behalf of Jimmy and myself, it's been our pleasure, and we're going to take Q&A now.
Can I just say
Go
one
ahead.
thing? Just real quick, what Alan had just mentioned. In the Gospels, in Matthew, Jesus said to his apostles, "Who do you say that I am?" Well, some of them probably felt, "Oh, I hope he doesn't call on me because I don't really know." Others said, "Oh, you're one of the prophets." Another one said, "John the Baptist." But Jesus said, "Who do you say that I am?" And Simon said, "The Son of the living God." And Jesus said, "Simon Bar-Jonah, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven." Kepha, Aramaic for Peter. You will be the rock, and upon this rock my church will be built. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, he's asking you, who do you say that I am? Thank you.
Dan's got I think, the microphone. So who has a question?
Any questions? I see a question.
Yes, ma'am. Right over here.
I like your chosen t-shirt.
Oh,
too,
thank
by the
you.
way.
I love the chosen. I wanted to ask you, you're mentioning the shape of the cross, and I know that Constantine's mother found the true cross, and you mentioned that they would keep the main post there, and then, so can you explain why that post was taken down, or did she just find the top part of the cross? You know, when she found the true cross, like, why did they take it down, the part that he was hung on?
So our thinking is that she probably would have found the patibulum, the arm bar. Also, and I'm glad you brought that up because I forgot to mention this earlier. She also found the title board, and I have a replica of the title board that she found. The title board would have actually looked like this. And this is copied from the relic in Santa Croce. They discovered that the actual title board was made of walnut wood, and it was painted white with white gypsum or whitewashed, and the letters were written in red from right to left. And it's Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And St. Helena found it with the patibulum, but it was not attached. So the legend is there were 3 beams. She didn't know which one belonged to our Lord, so they called someone who was sick, and the first beam did nothing, second beam did nothing, the third beam cured the person. So she took the wood and distributed it out. The Jews protested in the gospel because if you read every other word in Hebrew, it says Yahweh or God. So this actually says God, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. This is why they said, oh, it's a blasphemy, take it down, because they knew how to read Hebrew. And curiously, all that's left today of the relic is the only part that says King. The rest of it has decayed.
I don't know if you could deduct anything about this. When Simon of Cyrene helped Jesus, was there any indication that anything in the marks or so on that indicated that in what you have gotten here?
So nothing, I mean, the shroud doesn't show that the beam was lifted. We go by the Gospels because it says that, you know, in the Gospel of Luke, it says they placed the crossbeam on Simon and he carried it behind Jesus. In the other Gospels, Matthew and Mark, it says that Simon helped carry the cross. John says he carried his cross to the place of execution. But we know based on the shroud that eventually this person was not able to carry this beam. The dehydration, the blood loss, the profuse sweating, the dislocated shoulder, it was just, he could no longer go on. So the shroud, it doesn't tell us that somebody carried the crossbeam, but it is consistent with the Gospels according to the wounds on the shroud, would be consistent with what was written, that he needed absolute help. You're welcome. Thank you.
Question back there.
You may have already said this, but what kind of wood was the crossbeam? I always heard it was a dogwood, but is that true?
So the pieces of wood that they have, there's 2 in Notre Dame. There's some in the Vatican and other pieces of the relic that have been scattered throughout. The ones that they have done examinations on, the wood comes from pine. So it was pine wood. The title board they investigated and it was walnut wood.
After they nailed his hands to the cross, did they remove the ropes that had been, or well, I guess they already did if Simon was carrying it to the site, is that right?
Correct. So, and that's actually a really good question. A lot of people are under the impression that the 2 thieves were tied and Jesus was nailed. Archaeology has shown that anybody who is crucified under Roman rule, you are nailed. You are not tied. The victim of Gavit Matar that they excavated, they found that he was nailed. And it would be impossible to nail and tie somebody because you would not be able to pull up. You wouldn't survive. So we know based on the shroud that he was not tied. Once he was untied from the beam, he was nailed. And we are pretty certain that, you know, all crucifixion victims, you were nailed, you weren't tied, because you wouldn't be able to survive it. Dr. Frank Zugibe found that out when he tied people to the cross. They couldn't raise themselves up. So he had to take them down and come up with another idea. And what he did was he created nails that had hooks that they could hold on to and then pull themselves up in order to breathe. But he found that once they were tied, I mean, that was, after 12 minutes, they couldn't last.
From the scourging at the pillar to Calvary, what was the distance that Jesus had to go? Is there any?
So according to the old city of Jerusalem, from the Antonia fortress to where it is believed to be Golgotha, it's about 600 yards. And most of that would have been through the city until they got to the outside gate. And then Golgotha was on the outside of the gate. And apparently it was facing northwest of the temple. So as Christ was crucified, while on the cross, he would be able to see the temple. And I just discovered something that was actually really neat information. At Passover, at 12 o'clock, the rabbi would blow the shofar or the ram's horn. He would do it at 12 o'clock and he would do it again at 3 o'clock. So at the time that Christ was nailed to the cross, they were blowing the shofar, meaning that the lambs had been brought to the temple. At 3 o'clock, they would blow the shofar, saying that the lambs had been sacrificed. So as Jesus was nailed to the cross, he would have heard that shofar, the true Lamb of God. And then right before he died, they would have blown the shofar again that the lambs had been sacrificed. Isn't that something? How it's all connected. And these are the little things that I like to tell people, because these are the things that we don't know. And when we know these, it just brings us so much closer that this is the promised Messiah.
Well, Dan?
Looks like we're at the end. One last question. I feel like Bill Donahue.
I wanted to know, like, how did they miss his artery? Like, if I were to nail her, I might like hit her artery. Can you tell? I mean, like, I know they're experts, but.
So actually, that's a really good question. Do we have any nurses or doctors here? Okay, so if you have a victim who's been stabbed and the knife is still in the wound, the worst thing you can do is take the knife out because you bleed out. But if you have that knife stuck in the wound, it sort of acts as a barrier to that wound. So if any arteries were hit, the nail would have plugged that hole until they pulled the nail out. Yeah, it's a really good question. And actually, nobody's really asked me that before, so that was a really good question.
Well, we've got on display Jimmy's artifacts over here, his replicas, his relic of the crown of thorns. And these are some of the collection that came from my dad's books. There's a hologram here of the face of Christ imaged with the face of the Shroud of Turin. And there's a 3D model that when my dad passed away, my family passed it on to me. So it's a little fragile, but you're welcome to take pictures of it. When you came in, Dan was kind enough to give you just a fact sheet. It really summarizes a lot, except Jimmy's the first one I've heard really take us into the extra cloths and into divine mercy. It's absolutely phenomenal to listen to him. And please, I hope you have a holy card if you have a child or a friend at home or someone, and we got an extra one, please take them a holy card.
Extras back there.
Great. Dan, you can wrap it up.
So, thank you all so much for coming. I can't wait for next year. Every year it builds, so who knows what we're going to be faced with next year. I mean, there could be, with AI and everything. But I think we've really been treated to a lot of great information, and it's a blessing. It makes me want to bring back Joe Murtha to talk about the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. So if people are interested in that, that's a good one too. Not quite as fancy as this one. This is really, really good.
We'd be interested.
Yeah, you guys, it's really set the bar high. So thank you again. Hopefully everybody has a safe trip home. And again, on behalf of Brian Hiles, our Grand Knight here at Our Lady of Guadalupe 12127 and St. John Neumann and Monsignor Pankey, thank you all for coming. And it is live streamed, so if you want to watch it again, or if you know somebody that would be very interested in this, please share it.
Jim, did I miss any questions on the live stream?
Yeah, any questions, Jim? Nothing
Okay.
on the live stream?
We're,
Okay,
we're clean on the live stream. All right.
thanks, Jim.
All right. Well, you all enjoy what's up here. Thank you. Thank you.